If ever there was a place that could be described as Sleepy Hollow, then Little Stretton in Leicestershire would be the ideal choice. At the time of the incident about to be related, it was felt that there was a controversial outcome to the trial. Was it murder, manslaughter, or a freak accident? We shall see. This is Vintage Murders and the deadly case of the stranger on a green bicycle. During the evening of the 5th of July 1919, a local farmer called Joe Conrad discovered the body of a young woman in the road along with her bicycle. He immediately contacted the police and told Constable Hall, who in turn called for Dr. Williams, the local physician, to attend the scene. The trio carried the body of the stricken woman back to the farmhouse, where the doctor made a quick examination of the corpse by candlelight. He concluded that she was the victim of some motoring accident. The next day, P.C. Hall resumed his search of the area at 6 a.m. and found bloodstains on a gate near to where the body was discovered, but no footprints. After further searching, he later found a .455 caliber bullet, which had been slightly obscured by the imprint of a horse. During his search, he also noted a dead crow in the field, just the other side of the gate, and thought no more about it. He was later criticised for not giving it more attention, rightly or wrongly. He returned to the farmhouse and took a closer look at the face of the victim after cleaning away some mud. This showed that a single bullet had entered her head just below the eye. This was confirmed by a subsequent post-mortem, that the shot would have been fired from 6 to 7 feet from the victim, who was soon identified as Bella Wright, a 21-year-old girl who worked for a local company, Bates & Co. She was described as respectable and was due to be married to a naval stoker in Portsmouth, who was awaiting demobilisation. She had been on a late shift that day, and after work was riding to see her cousin, who lived at Galby, who was expecting a baby. On the way, she had stopped to adjust the back wheel on her bike, when she was passed by another cyclist, who stopped and asked if he could be of any assistance, and she had asked him if he had a spanner. He replied that he had one, and offered to try to fix the wheel. When the adjustment had been completed, and Bella's bike was in workable order again, the stranger suggested that they ride together. When they arrived in Galby, the stranger did not go on his way, but hung around the cottage where Bella's cousin lived. At dusk, she left the cottage and was surprised to see the stranger outside, as indeed were her uncle and cousin. The uncle engaged the stranger in conversation regarding his bike, which was green rather than the standard black. But they also talked about the unusual use of a coaster brake, commonly called a back pedal brake, which was rare in those days. The two cyclists headed off, and one was found dead, and the other had disappeared. It is worth noting that it was later learned that Bella had not taken the shortest route home, for whatever reason. So who was this mysterious stranger? There were a number of witnesses to the couple, and a local bicycle repairman reported that he had repaired such a green bike on the day of the killing. The police issued a description, which was sent out, asking about the whereabouts of a man aged between 35 to 40 years, about 5 foot 7 inches to 5 foot 9 inches in height, wearing a grey suit and cap, collar and tie, and black boots. Given that the accused was only 24 years old at the time, you can understand the lack of success. The police were able to locate the shop that sold the bike, and they kept excellent records that showed that Ronald Light had purchased the actual machine in question. Consequently, Light was arrested on the 4th of March 1920, and at first tried to bluff his way out of the situation. On seeing the receipt with his signature, he agreed he had bought the bicycle, but professed that he had sold it to a fellow officer in 1916, but could not remember his name. So who was this Ronald Light? He was born on the 19th of October 1895 to a wealthy civil engineer. From an early age, he had a propensity to get into trouble. For instance, at the age of 17, he was expelled from Oakham School for pulling a girl's clothes over her head. Apparently, he didn't get into any further grief and graduated as a civil engineer from the University of Birmingham. He joined the Midland Railways as a draftsman, but was sacked in August 1914 for allegedly setting fire to a cupboard and writing lewd graffiti on a lavatory wall. Later he was caught trying to set fire to a haystack. When the First World War started, he joined the Royal Engineers as a second lieutenant. He had to resign his commission due to conduct unbecoming of an officer and subsequently joined the Honorary Artillery Company as a gunner. But trouble continued to follow him as he was court-martialed for forging mobilisation orders to France. He escaped punishment and was medically discharged as suffering from shell shock and deafness. At his trial it was noted that he had a penchant for pestering young women. But more critical to this case was the issue of his bike. He had purchased a deluxe version in 1910 and had it modified to be mint green rather than the standard black. Better saddle, upturned handlebars and, crucially, coaster brakes or back pedal brakes as they were known. A rare and unique piece of machinery. Light stated that he only became aware of the incident after a conversation between his ailing mother and a maid. So what happened to the bicycle? For a while, Light kept it in the attic and then disposed of it partly in the canal and partly in the river. He also disposed of all the clothes that he had worn on the day of the murder. Months passed, and Light continued to teach maths at a school in Cheltenham. On the 23rd of February, Enoch Whitehouse was out fishing, and his hook snagged the back wheel of a bike with a strange set of brakes in the canal. He contacted the police, who ordered that the canal be dredged. They recovered the rest of the original green bike, together with a holster and a box of ammunition of the calibre used in the murder, but no gun. Someone had tried to file off the serial number of the bike, but it was still recognised by the manufacturers. Light kept silent of whether he was still the owner of the green bike when questioned, or that he was the stranger who had accompanied Bella on that fateful early evening. He was identified in a lineup as the man concerned on that fateful journey. The circumstantial evidence was going to be enough to hang him. Light was put on trial weeks later, and the prosecution was formidable, being the Attorney General Sir Gordon Harcourt. Their case rested on the fact that the body was discovered only 35 minutes after she had set out from her uncle's cottage with the defendant. They speculated that he had made unwanted advances to her and that she'd gone on to another route to escape, and subsequently the accused had shot her. In 1920, you needed money for a good defence, as legal aid did not arrive until a rudimentary one later in the decade. But Ronald Light was not without financial resources, and his mother hired the best defence barrister in the land, and his name was Sir Edward Marshall Hall. If you were facing the gallows, and the circumstantial evidence was strong, he was your man, and pointed out the fact of there being no obvious motive for the crime. But this was immediately dismissed by the judge. To a modern audience, it seems odd that the press was sympathetic to the accused. He was portrayed as having been a decent officer who had done his bit in the war, while the victim was referred to as just a factory girl. You have to read this in the context of the time. Prior to the war, a large number of occupations were denied to women, but this rule was relaxed as the menfolk had been sent to the front. Light had to be compelled to reveal that he had ridden with the victim. A bicycle, holster and a box of .455 ammunition had been thrown in the river and canal to avoid detection. Also, he disposed of the clothes he was wearing that evening. In normal circumstances, he was looking at a one-way trip to the gallows before the end of the year. Courtrooms and trials are constrained by schedules and the need to show a timeline of consistency. But in reality, courtroom scenes are a mess. Witnesses may or may not turn up in the correct sequence or at all. Counsel is arguing over technical points in which the jury is sent out until it has been resolved. It is no wonder that each side has to sum up the case at the end in order to get the jury to have any understanding of the issues involved. In this case, there were different main themes: witnesses, firearms, and the defendant himself. They needed to be split into sections to make any sense. The first statements were from those who saw both Bella Wright and Ronald Light on the day in question. But two girls claimed that one morning in July 1919 they had been pestered by a man on a green bicycle. This would be consistent with the prosecution's case of him being annoying with girls. But their testimony was undermined by the police suggestion of that actual date. It was discovered that they had read about the case for over a year since it had happened. The judge told the jury to dismiss this account of events. One witness who was called was Dr. Williams, who had first medically examined the corpse. He had preserved a section of her skin in formaldehyde, which showed the entry point of the wound. Marshall Hall produced a slender silver pencil that showed it could be barely passed through the wound. Marshall Hall contended that a .455 caliber bullet, being fired so close, would have practically blown half her face off. The bullet must have been fired from a longer range. The following is the exchange between the silver-tongued barrister and the provincial doctor that illustrates his undoubted legal prowess. Marshall Hall: a bullet going in an upward direction, as shown in the autopsy, at high velocity, is found 6 yards away from the body. The doctor's reply was that, "My theory is the woman was shot whilst lying in the road, and the bullet went through her head into the ground." Marshall Hall: if a bullet was fired without any further resistance than the girl's head, it would be absurd to suppose that it would be found only 6 yards away. The doctor agreed with this statement. Now it was time to interrogate the firearms expert. There were different elements to this cross-examination, and the exchange between the two parties reveals the brilliance of Marshall Hall. Now, remember the dead crow found in the field near to where the corpse lay? The gunsmith was asked to look through his microscope and address the issue of the mark on the bullet. It showed it had passed through a rifle barrel. Marshall Hall: this bullet could be fired from a rifle as well as a revolver. Gunsmith: yes. Marshall Hall changed tack and gave the gunsmith the possibility of an accident. Marshall Hall: supposing the shot to have been fired some distance away, and that in its flight it came in contact with a fence, tree, or something else, and then struck someone in the roadway, would you expect to find that bullet within a few feet of where the person was shot? Gunsmith: yes, it's possible. After a series of technical queries, Marshall Hall changed direction again and posed the following questions. Have you seen a human being who's been shot at a distance of within 5 yards with a service revolver? Gunsmith: no, sir. Given the proximity of the war, one wonders whether some members of the jury who had recently experienced active service, what they would have made of the claims of this so-called expert witness. Marshall Hall maintained his attack, stating, "I suggest that the effect of such a bullet on the skull of a human being is almost to blow the sides of the head off." Gunsmith: it depends on the velocity. Marshall Hall: of course it does. But to win the case, Ronald Light would have to explain his behaviour on that day. The circumstantial evidence could still send him to the gallows. The defence took the unusual step of calling the defendant as a witness. Normally, the last place you want the defendant is in the witness box, as they tend to have a depressing tendency to convict themselves. Importantly, the barrister could not be accused of coaching his witness or encouraging him to commit perjury. But Marshall Hall was not totally in the dark, as he had heard other witnesses describe Light and would have consulted the latter's solicitor prior to the trial. Whilst Marshall Hall had not met Ronald Light personally prior to the trial, he received a letter from him which shows the accused's line of defence and is worth quoting in full. "Will you please ask me to tell the jury in my own words exactly why I did not come forward? I shall say I was dreadfully worried and for some days quite dazed at such an unexpected blow and could not think clearly. When I began to think, I could not make up my mind to come forward, and hesitated for days. I shall have done so, but they jumped to wrong conclusions, and I was frightened when I saw I was wanted for murder. Let me do this in my own words." The eventual cross-examination lasted 5 hours, and Light never deviated from his version of events. Obviously, the accused was never going to crack on the witness stand. Marshall Hall, in his summing up, gave the unusual excuse of an ailing mother. To get a flavour of his undoubted skill of appealing to the emotions of a jury, few lines in his summing up is well worth quoting. "You must not forget that he is a man who has undergone the awful ordeal of shell shock, which reduces the strongest men to human wrecks, and leaves them bereft of human strength." The judge later congratulated Marshall Hall on his conduct of the defence. Light was acquitted of the murder charge to general acclaim, and was free to go on his way. In Britain in 1920, practically every family in the land had lost a male relation in the war. All members of the jury would be reminded of the tragedy of seeing a telegram announcing the death of a relation or a close friend. There's been much controversy about this verdict. In recent years, a typewritten note by Levi Bowley, Superintendent of Leicestershire Police, 3 days after Ronald Light's acquittal, has come to light after being stored in a safe. He was known to be sympathetic to Light, and the note claims that the accused made the following confession. "I did shoot the girl, but it was completely accidental. We were riding quietly along. I had a revolver in my pocket and dismounted for her to look at it. I had no idea there was a loaded cartridge in it. Her hand was out to take it when it went off. She fell and never stirred. I got on my bicycle and rode away." Why would a senior police officer not talk to his superiors about this confession? If he did not reveal his source, then he risked being drummed out of the force. But there is much doubt about the veracity and authenticity of this note. Unfortunately, the Ronald Lights of this world are part of the rich tapestry of life. He was certainly a pest to women, but you may not describe him as a cold-blooded killer. He was inadequate, and regrettably, his type will always be with us. But like amateur crime sleuths combing through old cuttings, we may never know the truth.